In an attempt to curb carbon emissions and get out in front of climate change, should we consider taxing not cars, but beef and other red meats? Well, one country, Denmark, is considering doing just that. Their Council on Ethics, an independent body that advises the government, said this week that Danes have an ethical obligation to fight climate change. And to push them to do that, it called for a climate tax on red meat specifically. It's a quote from one of the members of that Council on Ethics. It says, Danes are ethically obligated to change their eating habits, but they won't lower their red meat consumption just because it's the right thing to do. An effective response to climate-damaging foods that will also contribute to raising awareness of climate change must be united, which requires that society sends a clear signal through regulation. And so, again, this is not the Denmark's government yet. This is just a body that advises them. But we know that a lot of those countries, much more lib than the U.S., it's not impossible that they would make this move and increase the taxes on them. What do you think?
I don't know if it makes sense to draw parallels between this and cigarettes in the U.S. Because I know in the U.S. we wanted people to stop smoking because of the high rates of cancer linked to smoking cigarettes. And so we used extremely high taxes to discourage people from smoking, right? If it's expensive, then you're less likely to continue your habit or even pick up the habit. But coupled with that was an educational campaign that really raised awareness about how harmful smoking was. And then you see the rates of smokers drop year by year by year. And so you could use the same type of strategy when it comes to something like red meat. I think there are a lot of people out there who still don't know the type of damage, red meat is causing to our environment. And it's not because you're just eating red meat, it's because producing red meat is taking a toll on our environment. And I think an educational campaign, in addition to possibly taxing it, could be effective.
And interestingly, when you think to the future and how, I'm going to have some stats for you in just a second on how intensive it is on the environment to produce this meat. And understand, I'm not a vegetarian. I eat this meat. I don't buy a lot of it and cook it at home, partially because it already is so expensive and also because I'm lazy. So maybe in the future, with millennials being lazy in terms of cooking on their own, maybe this will cut into the meat consumption. But then you think about how farming will be impacted as climate change continues. And it will be more difficult to grow certain crops. It's not impossible to imagine that meat will just naturally be far more expensive in the future. Because we won't have as much water to use on things like it.
You make a good
maybe
point.
We should get ready for it.
And by the way, I mean, the price of meat is already having an impact on my habits at least. Because now that I know about, some of the terrible things that are done to cattle prior to us eating them, I make sure that I go after, if I'm going to eat red meat, it's grass-fed, organic, cows that are treated nicely.
Complimented.
But that's expensive. And it's so expensive that I just don't eat red meat as much as I used to, not even close. I mean, I go weeks without eating red meat. So my consumption of it has definitely gone down quite a bit. And I know I'm going to get a bunch of comments and emails from people that are like, you should be vegan at this point. I know. I'll do my best.
We're getting there.
Maybe.
It takes a little while.
It does. It's hard. It's really hard. I grew up on an Armenian diet of red meat. They eat a lot of red meat. And so it's hard for me to completely just cut it out of my diet. And so, look, guys, being judgmental about other people's diets is not going to convince them to change, right? I think educating people and telling them about the impact of their eating habits in a nice way would have more of an impact and would be more effective.
Now you might wonder, why are we thinking about making this change? Like, okay, so there's some cows and there's a farm or whatever. Like, I know you already want me to stop driving a gas guzzler, but what's the point of dealing with the cows? Well, the problem is actually much bigger than you might think. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization has determined that 18% of all greenhouse gas emissions, more than the total exhaust from all forms of transportation, that's cars, trucks, planes, trains, everything, comes from animal agriculture. Not all agriculture, just the animal portion of it. Raising cattle not only contributes 10% of those emissions, which is 10 points, not 10% of 18%, but it also takes over 11,000 gallons of fresh water to produce just over 2 pounds of beef. I don't even know how that's possible. That sounds crazy, but that's the way that it works right now. And you know that they are trying to be as efficient as possible to save money. Even then, it takes that much. Beef specifically requires 28 times more land and 11 times more water to produce than pork or chicken by weight, and it emits 5 times their climate-changing gases, according to The Guardian. So, like, look, we obviously, long term, whether we want to control our eating in terms of meat or not, we're going to have to. The pressure is going to continue to increase. But even before that, simply by switching from beef to something else, that might help a lot. And it's not as hard as getting rid of meat overall, but it could have a great effect on the atmosphere and on our water use, which is becoming a problem in lots of parts of the country and the world.